Okay, maybe we'll get started. Like to welcome everyone on behalf of the Watershed Security Fund, partnership with the First Nations Water Caucus, First Nations Fisheries Council, and the Real Estate Foundation of BC. Um, I'll start by introducing myself, and then I'll facilitate a round of introductions from the other panelists. And as some have started to do so here, feel free to introduce yourself in whatever way is most appropriate to you in the chat. So my name is Jenna Duncan. I'm the acting senior manager for the Habitat and Environmental Protection sector here at the First Nations Fisheries Council. The First Nations Fisheries Council is the secretariat for the First Nations Water Caucus. I'll just get who's next on my screen, and Leanne, if you can introduce yourself.
Thanks, Jenna, and good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us at this webinar. It's a real pleasure to be here and an honor to be doing this work on the Watershed Security Fund. My name's Leanne Sexsmith, and I'm the Director of Strategic Programs and Partnerships with the Real Estate Foundation. I'm joining you today from my home office on unceded Squamish Nation territory. And I will pass it over to Madison.
Hi everyone, thanks for joining today. My name is Madison Ratai, and I'm a manager with the First Nations Fisheries Council in the Habitat and Environmental Protections Unit. And I'll pass it to Cheyenne.
Morning, everyone. Thanks for being here today. My name is Cheyenne Berkhan-Hainahowen. I'm the Communications Manager at the Real Estate Foundation of BC, joining today from the unceded and traditional territories of the Lekwungen-speaking peoples. And I'm supporting on the communications for the Watershed Security Fund. And I'll pass it to Adarshana.
Hey, Cheyenne. Good morning, everyone. My name is Adarshana Thapa. I'm the program coordinator at the Real Estate Foundation of BC. I'm joining in today from the traditional territories of the Huron, Wendat, Seneca, and Mississaugas of the Credit. And I support with grants coordination, administration, and all the grants inquiries. So yeah, very happy to facilitate this webinar today. I think we have introduced everyone.
Thanks,
Pass it to Jenna.
So I'll just go through some of the objectives for the webinar today. So through this webinar, we hope to share information about the Watershed Security Fund and its newly developed grants program, to provide helpful information about the first intake and grants application process, hear and respond to questions, and gain insights from your questions and comments about areas to further clarify or consider for this intake or for future intakes. And in the weeks ahead, we'll update our frequently asked questions on our website based on questions raised today and others that might come in following today's session. We'll support application inquiries and share feedback from the webinar with our grants working group. And this initiative is innovative as we create something new to support BC watersheds. So we're all learning as we go and appreciate the opportunities to adapt and learn from your questions so that we can continue to make improvements moving forward. I'll just go over, Madison, if you don't mind moving to the next slide, our agenda for today. So there'll be 3 focus areas for our presentations. First will be an overview of the Watershed Security Fund. Then Leanne will provide an overview of the grants program. And finally, we'll share information about the grants program approach, the application process, and application guidance. Following each of these sections, we will open up for some questions. And as we're presenting, we encourage participants to put their questions directly in the Q&A box as they come up for you. You should be able to see a Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen. Questions captured in the Q&A box will be easier for us to track and answer. So prefer that those go in the Q&A rather than in the comments section. And you'll have the ability to upvote someone's question. So if you're interested in knowing that answer, feel free to upvote it so that we try to cover that question during the Q&A. Staff will also be going through and answering some questions in the Q&A box as we go. So if we don't answer verbally, we might answer via text. So feel free to look at the answered questions. And given the numbers, we won't be using the raised hand function, but fielding through the Q&A box. And we recognize that we may not be able to get to all of your questions during the webinar, but we'll do our best to update via the frequently asked questions page on our website. And also, if you have any further questions, we welcome you to reach out to us as well, so we can make sure that we get to your questions. I think that is all for me, and I will pass over to Madison to go over the overview.
Thanks, Jenna. So yeah, we'll just take you through a bit of an overview of the fund and kind of how we got to this point so far. So central to this initiative is the recognition that water is life and remains the most important environmental, cultural, economic, and spiritual wellspring we share. The Watershed Security Fund, we are dedicated to safeguarding the health of British Columbia's watersheds for future generations. We are working towards establishing a permanent funding stream, co-developed and co-governed with First Nations to support building resilient and healthy watersheds across the province. Our mission is to preserve watershed resilience and health through good governance and planning, collaboration, sustainable practices, and community engagement. By investing in projects that prioritize reconciliation, ecosystem restoration, climate resilience, and sustainable economics, we can ensure that watersheds remain healthy and vibrant for generations to come. The Real Estate Foundation of BC and the First Nations Water Caucus with the First Nations Fisheries Council are honored to collaborate as partners in this inspiring, impactful, and healing work. Together, we provide interim stewardship and support for the co-development of a permanent entity for the fund. The commitment to action between the parties provides the framework for RFBC, FNFC, and the Water Caucus to work together on timely and effective co-development, implementation, and administration of the fund. It describes principles, context, and oversight, as well as decision-making structures that align with and support the fund grant agreement. As you can see, the diagram on the right illustrates the joint venture structure that we are taking the diagram on our right shows that this joint venture structure that we're using as to steward the funds. So you can see we have our joint executive as the top, with joint manager as more the operational and support staff. So at our joint executive, we're very grateful to have the following members be a part. Lydia Whitsam, who is the co-commissioner of the First Nations Fishery Water Caucus, Hugh Breaker, who is the co-commissioner of the First Nations Water Caucus, Mavis Underwood, who is an RFBC governor, Leslie Dickey, who is also RFBC governor, Mark Gifford, who is the CEO of RFBC, Stu Barnes, who is the executive director of our FNFC, as well as a BC representative from the Ministry of Land, Water, and Resource Stewardship, who is an advisory role. And then we just wanted to walk through a bit of a timeline to show the journey that we've taken kind of in the past year. So since March 2023, which is when the $100 million endowment for the Watershed Security Fund was announced, partners have been focusing on creating a long, strong foundation of co-development at all levels of work. This includes building relationships between the Water Caucus, RFBC, and FNFC, confirming the commitment to action, and a partnership agreement, as well as identifying areas of work and confirming work plans. The Joint Executive had its inaugural meeting in December of 2023 and has also met in February and March of this year. Lastly, the Grants Working Group met for the first time in April of 2024. And then just to go over some of those areas of work that the joint venture has been prioritizing. So the Joint Executive has confirmed 8 major areas of work for the fund to support the implementation of the commitment to action. Work plans have been confirmed for 6 of these areas, which include the operations of Joint Executive, financial management, investment strategy and management, grants program, communications, and fund growth. An additional 2 areas of work have been identified and work plans will be developed this year: the co-development of the permanent entity and evaluation and learning work plans. I'll now pass it over to Cheyenne to kind of take us through some of the communications work.
Hey, Madison. So through our communications, we really hope to strengthen a shared understanding of the essential benefits that watersheds provide. We're hoping to tell the story of the work, so we hope to work with project teams and communities to bring visibility to the work, to their work, and to tell their story of their work. As we look towards growing the fund, communications will be a key tool in that work. We also hope to provide transparency and openness. We want to ensure we provide transparent openness in our communications as we continue this journey of co-developing the Watershed Security Fund. So if you haven't already done so, I do encourage you to sign up for our newsletter. I'll add the link into the chat. So if you go to our contact page, you can scroll down and there's a sign up for the newsletter. And that will be one of our main tools of communications on grants, on updates on the Watershed Security Fund. And then also behind the scenes, we are working away on creating a more comprehensive platform and brand that is reflective of our shared work to preserve the health and resilience of our watersheds. So the website you see now, that's just a temporary website, but we're hoping to launch the fresh new look at the end of the summer, so you can stay tuned for that. And that's all from me. Thank you, Madison.
Thanks, Cheyenne. Just encourage people, if you have questions, to pop them in the Q&A box. Just helps us sort them a little easier than in the comments section. I feel like some of the comments some of the questions might be addressed through what Leanne has put together next. So maybe we'll just move on to the first grants part 1 and see if we get any questions in. And then go from there, and we'll open it up for kind of a more in-depth Q&A. But yeah, just encourage you to pop any questions into the Q&A box. Thank you.
Good, thanks, Jenna. So, yeah, in this section of the webinar, we're going to focus specifically on the grants program and hope to answer as many questions as we can. So we're going to start with a higher level overview of the program, and then we're going to get into more specifics of the application and budget form. And after each of these 2 sections, we'll pause and hear some of the questions from the Q&A and do our best to answer those. We may not be able to get through all the questions. We'll see how it goes. We will be downloading them afterwards, though, and can update our FAQs to address what we're hearing today. Oh, sorry. And we're also going to be sharing this presentation through our website after this webinar. And I'll also just mention that the slides from today are already posted on the webinar as our grants program and application guide. You can download that on the grants page, and the FAQs that we've developed so far for the grants program are also on the grants page. There's some separate FAQs on the fund overall on its own tab. For grants program FAQs, it's a button and then you get the PDF. So we just have a temporary website right now, and down the road we'll have a more permanent website, and some of these things will be a little more seamless, but we hope that the resources we're providing now are helpful. So for the first part of the grants program, I'm going to run through each of these sections here, starting with the vision and moving through to goals, objectives, principles, some of our assessment criteria, and some of the application supports and guidance. So our work is guided by this overall vision for a future where flourishing watersheds and the unimpeded flow of water are of the utmost importance, and water is highly valued as the sacred source of life. Our grants program will support work that nourishes our waterways, upholds the strength of Indigenous voices and ways of being in relation to the land and water, and weaves together enduring relationships and partnerships between First Nations and non-First Nations that flow throughout and across watersheds. We hope that funding will meet water stewards and water champions where they're at, building partnerships and collaboration among First Nations, local governments, NGOs, and community groups, as well as scientific communities. And like the natural ebb and flow of our waterways, we will grow and evolve through this work, with water remaining the most important environmental, cultural, economic, and spiritual wellspring we share. That vision and other key aspects of our grants program were developed in partnership with the Watershed Security Fund Grants Working Group, which, as Madison mentioned, was convened in April, and it's supporting and providing direction on the co-development, design, and implementation of the grants program over the coming year. We're incredibly grateful for their leadership and wisdom. They are a diverse group of leaders with deep experience and connection to regional watershed needs and communities across territories across this province, and they are generously providing their learning and insights to support this work. So you can see the members here, and you can see the diversity of experience that they bring. This slide shows our journey over the past year since the initial 100 million commitment to the fund was made, and some of the foundational work that enabled us to get to an actual launch of a grants program. And once those foundational pieces were in place, the Water Caucus and Joint Executive indicated that getting dollars into community as soon as possible was a priority. We know there's a lot of pressures on our watersheds around the province, and there has been for many years. So a key focus the past 2 months has been on designing and launching our grants program. It's been a pretty tight timeline with a small staff team and a modest amount of granting dollars available in this first year. So we're doing our best to bring a good program forward that reflects the seasonal and cyclical nature of watershed work, and also allows time for periods of reflection and renewal, learning, and ongoing adaptation. So as Jenna mentioned, we're learning as we're going here, and we'll continue to evolve the program. So yeah, and I noticed a question in the chat about the grants, how much of the endowment is going to grants, and I will speak to that in a moment. But first of all, I'll just talk about some of our goals and objectives. So our grant agreement with the province, combined with the commitment to action agreement and work plans for the fund, are the basis for these key program outcomes, goals, and objectives. So overall outcomes include reconciliation and advancing UNDRIP, restoring and maintaining ecosystem services and watershed health, climate resiliency, local watershed governance, planning and monitoring initiatives, job creation and economic stimulus, learning and relationship building between Indigenous and non-Indigenous communities. And then you can see in the circles here some of the more specific goals and objectives for the program. Core principles and values that underpin all aspects of the grants program are shown here. We recognize there's a shared reliance and need to work together to care for the natural world and for water. We see the importance of taking a holistic, whole-of-watershed approach. We recognize that First Nations title, rights, and sovereignty are crucial to the health and sustainability of lands and waters, and that First Nations leadership, voices, and ways of being are crucial in guiding ways forward. We want to show up in this work in a spirit of reciprocity, relationship, and meaningful partnership. We want to honor and respect a diversity of perspectives and move toward new forms of shared decision-making and ways of addressing power imbalances and equity. And we want to take an intergenerational long-term focus. So within the grant funding program, funding is available to support projects and initiatives in each of these types of work, or we're calling them funding themes. And we do recognize the holistic interwoven aspects of watershed work and understand that most projects will connect across several of these areas. It is also worth noting that our funding is focused on land and freshwater systems within watershed basins, and marine projects are not a particular focus for this funding. And for now, we have these high-level descriptions of each of the funding themes. And in these early years, we do know that projects may be limited by our small grants budget. So for example, larger nature-based infrastructure projects or large-scale restoration projects, we know those often require millions of dollars in funding. And given our small grant sizes, this might mean we can only fund a portion of that work, such as planning and design aspects, rather than a full-scale multi-hectare restoration project. But we do hope that can evolve with a growing fund and growing annual grants budget that would go with that. And we can also adapt and potentially focus these funding themes more in the future. So if anyone has feedback on these categories and descriptions, we welcome your comments on those. So advancing UNDRIP is an overarching priority for the fund, and there are a number of ways we'll look to support that. Teachings from Indigenous leaders and outcomes from previously funded work demonstrate that the most effective means of advancing UNDRIP is for Indigenous-led teams to design and direct projects to the benefit of their nations and members. For non-First Nations-led project teams, upfront partnership development and co-design of project objectives with the nations involved is a key enabler of advancing UNDRIP as well. Additional ways may be through project activities that support the exercise of Indigenous rights, incorporation of First Nations knowledge, communications and outreach to First Nations leadership, and weaving of Indigenous ceremony, training, rights, and interests into budgets, planning, and activities. And for non-First Nations organizations who are at early stages, their relationship building with nations, there may be other ways they can action commitments through learning and building understanding about their host nations. And so using a framework developed by Tara Marsden, we ask a number of questions on the grant application that help us understand where projects are at in advancing UNDRIP. The review and decision-making process for grant applications will also consider other dimensions of a project proposal. So in addition to UNDRIP, we're looking at 5 additional assessment criteria, and these are grounded in learnings from prior investments in BC watersheds and the principles and values that underpin the Watershed Security Fund grants program. Applicants can briefly describe how their project addresses one or more of these aspects: free, prior, informed consent, regional equity, community connection, economic resiliency, jobs, training and mentorship, and diversity of interests and collaboration. And this slide here provides some additional background on why we feel these aspects are so important and relevant to the work. We ask about free, prior, informed consent because we recognize Indigenous people's right to determine and develop priorities and strategies for the development or use of their lands or territories and other resources as described in UNDRIP Article 32. We ask questions to understand regional equity considerations, recognizing that some regions experience particular challenges or barriers in accessing water-related funding or other resources, and may be at greater risk from climate or cumulative impacts. We ask about community connection because we believe communities have a deep understanding of their own needs, priorities, solutions, and community-connected projects support important trust building, accountability, and shared responsibility over the long term. We're interested in economic resiliency, jobs, training, and mentorship, as these are valued outcomes of watershed work with many interrelated community benefits, which we want to support. And for certain types of projects, ensuring a diversity of interests are involved in collaborative approaches may be particularly relevant, especially when working across jurisdictions or to support shared learning. So depending on the scale and nature of project work and whether it is just getting started or is further along, some projects may just address a few of these and some may address all of them. So our total grants budget envelope for this year is 7 to 10 million, and that includes 3 to 5 million in funding from the fund in terms of earnings or interest earned on the fund, plus a contribution of up to $5 million, which has been contributed by the Real Estate Foundation to supplement the grants budget in this first year. So available funds in this first year are modest because the goal under the terms of our grant agreement with the province is to keep the initial investment of $100 million whole as an endowment base. And so, you know, if you can imagine interest earnings of say 5 to 6% over the course of a year, and this of course fluctuates depending on markets, that forms a portion or the majority of the grants budget that comes from the fund itself. We do hope there will be additional contributions to the fund in the coming years, either to build the endowment base much larger or as flow-through dollars that supplement an annual grants budget, such as those contributed by REFBC for this year. And an overall aspiration is to build the fund to be a $1 billion fund that grants out $75 million annually. So, you know, we have a ways to go, but I'm really happy to be able to get some dollars out to community quickly this year. With this grants budget of 7 to 10 million, we'll aim to see that funding allocated to approved projects across 2 open call intakes in 2024-25. So that first intake opened this June, and that's till June 26 for grants approved in September and funds flowing starting in October 2024. And then a second intake is we hope to open in late 2024, early 25 for grants approved next spring. And for this first intake, with sort of a short runway to launch, we're anticipating allocating approximately a third of the 2024 budget and allowing a bit more time for folks to get organized for that second intake, where we anticipate allocating approximately 2/3 of the year's annual grants budget. And given our small initial budget, we are taking a scaled developmental approach with 3 funding streams that support a range of project sizes at different stages. We hope this can enable some funding for organizations and projects who are well on their way with a foundation of prior work, and also offer resources to others at earlier stages of project conception, design, research, or relationship building. Decisions on how many projects will be funded in each of these streams across the 2 intakes have not been made, and it will depend on the mix of applications received. But just for illustrative purposes, with this year's grant budget, we can conceive or imagine potentially funding about 50 projects with a mix of grant sizes. Again, we realize this is not a lot of dollars compared to the enormous needs in community and the high cost of restoration work, but best we can do as we're starting out. We have received quite a few questions about whether organizations can make applications in both intakes this year, and whether they're eligible to make applications in future years if they have an existing Watershed Security Fund grant. And so it might just touch on that now. We are still working through some of these scenarios with the grants working group. But we imagine it's possible that organizations who receive a Watershed Security Fund grant could be eligible to apply for another grant in future years when existing funded work is nearing completion. And that would be contingent on the strength and success of their prior project and our goals and assessment lenses that we're weighing, you know, across quite a few different factors. So, funding the same organization twice in the same year would be very unlikely at this stage with such a small initial grants budget, as our intent and overall goal is, you know, to support a diversity of projects at different stages. And yeah, anyways, that question has come up quite a bit, so just thought we'd try to cover that now. And as part of the grants program, another aspect we're interested in understanding is organizational relationship to First Nations. And as the inherent rights holders of these lands and waters who have protected and cared for them for millennia, First Nations must have a central role in this work if we are to uphold UNDRIP commitments and to achieve the transformative change towards healthy, secure watersheds that I think we're all hoping for. At the same time, it's also recognized that repairing the harms of many years of colonial impacts can't fall solely on the shoulders of First Nations, and there is a shared reliance and need to care for the natural world and water that we all depend on. Relationships between First Nations people and organizations, NGOs, colonial governments, industry, and local communities are all essential to healthy watersheds now and in the future. So enabling diverse interests to support and strengthen watershed security is also an important part of this work and is reflected in the funding priorities and eligibility guidelines as well. So across the 3 funding streams at higher levels of funding, there will be some prioritization of projects led by organizations who are generally further along the continuum towards First Nations-led work or First Nations partnered or informed work. And right now we have these general guidelines rather than specific funding targets and percentages. So our overall goal is to center First Nations voices, experiences, approaches, and leadership while also making space for resourcing important work of non-Indigenous-led initiatives that contribute to holistic, collaborative, shared ways forward for addressing watershed needs. Overall, eligible organizations for Watershed Security Fund grant funding include Indigenous or non-Indigenous registered nonprofits, educational institutions, social enterprises, or First Nations, including First Nations governments, tribal councils, and others, and local and regional governments. And eligibility is not restricted to Canada Revenue Agency registered charities or qualified donees. There's a number of things we're not able to fund, and those are shown on the left-hand side of this slide and also listed in the application form and on our website. So in alignment with our principles, we do want our grants program to be approachable, accessible, adaptable, and supported, and grounded in good relations, trust, and partnership. There are several ways we can provide support and guidance to potential applicants, and that includes through our website, application guide, and FAQs, through these webinars, which are being recorded and will be available on our website, by being accessible through emails, phone calls, and other connections with program staff that can be arranged through Adarshana, our grants program coordinator. And then we're also offering 3 ways to apply for a grant. There's our online portal that's accessed through a link on our Watershed Security Fund grants website. There's a Word document available to download from the grants website page, and you can fill that out and submit it by email. We also recommend that even if you're doing the online portal, that you download that document and use it as a bit of a tool to pre-prepare some of your answers for the portal. We found that makes it a little easier for people. And generally, for each intake, we're also enabling groups to arrange with Adarshana, our grants program coordinator, to do an interview through Zoom, Teams, or a phone call as a way to do your application. So our program staff would complete the application based on your conversation and then send it back to you to confirm before it's submitted. But this is something that does need a little bit more time to arrange, just because the back and forth does take a little bit longer. So we were asking people to make those arrangements prior to June 18th if they wanted to submit for this intake. And if not, if you're considering it for a future intake, just to please arrange that well in advance. So I'll just stop sharing and pause now, and we can answer a few questions from the Q&A.
Thanks, Leanne. Yeah, we have quite a few questions popping in, so it's great to see. I'll take this one first. So it says, if someone has also applied for funding from REFBC, are they still allowed to apply to the Watershed Security Fund? So stacking funding for a project.
They are eligible to apply for the Watershed Security Fund. It is its own distinct program. We did receive another question previously about whether the Watershed Security Fund is replacing the Real Estate Foundation's freshwater funding through our general grants, and it is not replacing that funding. They are distinct, different programs with different governance structures and decision making.
Another question is, you mentioned marine projects are not a focus. However, would a holistic health of watershed report, including indicators of quality of life, coastal communities, freshwater and marine health, be a suitable project for this fund?
Jenna, do you want to take this question?
Sure. Definitely. I think that with watershed projects, looking at that whole of watershed approach is important to us. So kind of it's that holistic view. It might be eligible. I also recommend contacting our team through the grants email if you want to chat through it further and get a little bit more insight. But yeah, I think that whole of watershed kind of approaches are something that's very important to this fund. I don't know, Leanne, if you have anything else you want to add.
That sounds good. Thanks, Jenna.
One person has 3 questions, so I'll just kind of take it each at a time. So the first question is, what kind of letters of support are needed? And is there a grace period in terms of further deadlines for letters of support?
I can jump in on this one if you want, Jenna. We are looking, if you're demonstrating a partnership and work with First Nations or other partners, we are looking for evidence of a meaningful partnership that reflects the other information that you've provided on your grant application form. So for example, your organizational relationship to First Nations. So we are looking for evidence of that, and that evidence can come in a variety of forms. It does not, you're not required to submit a letter of support. We welcome letters of support, but there's other ways that you can provide that evidence. It could be through an MOU, it could be through videos or other examples of your project work together. So just keep that in mind with letters of support. If you are going to use a letter of support, then a couple of things. You can use a letter of support that was submitted to another funder. And you can also provide a letter of support like in an email format. It doesn't need to be in a formalized letter. And we would prefer if you PDF those kinds of documents when you send them to us. And we can receive letters of support after the deadline, but we do ask that the other evidence be provided with your application. So in time for the deadline, and if you want to send us a letter after the fact, we can accept that, but make sure that evidence is there, as we have a short timeline to review these projects. We'll be reviewing in July. So yeah, we'll look for that.
Perfect. And the second question is, how does the Watershed Security Fund define Indigenous-led? They have an example about a society that is First Nation-led that could be leading the project. Would this count as an Indigenous-led for the grant?
Do you want to take this one, Jenna?
Sure. So we're, as Leanne had mentioned, we're using the I4DM matrix in our definition. So I think that Adarshana had provided a link in the chat that goes through kind of some categories of what is Indigenous benefiting, Indigenous informed, Indigenous partnered, and Indigenous led. So I don't want to go through all, but there's kind of in the leadership, the values, kind of protocol, program team, accountability to community and reciprocity sections, kind of has a bit of a definition for what Indigenous led looks like. So we encourage you to have a look through that and see if it kind of matches up with what your organization looks like.
Thanks, Jenna. I would also just add that in the context of the Watershed Security Fund, So we are using the Circle's I4DM matrix as a guide, and they talk about Indigenous benefiting, Indigenous informed, Indigenous partnerships, and Indigenous led. And as Jenna said, there's descriptions across a number of areas to help you understand where you are on that continuum. For the fund, because in BC, First Nations are rights and title holders of lands and waters in this province, we at the fund are specifically looking at First Nations led or First Nations partnerships and so forth. So we recognize in Canada there's also Métis and Inuit peoples. And for our purposes, we're particularly looking at your organizational relationship to First Nations. There's also a great article, I don't know, on the I4DM that is a supplement to the tool that we've linked to as well. And I don't know if you're able to pop that in the chat, Adarshana. Thanks.
Maybe we'll do 2 more questions. We have time for that, and then
Sure.
so first will be will there be additional endowments, or was this a one-time allocation?
Do you want to take this one, Jenna?
I can start. This was a one-time endowment from the province. We would love to see additional endowments or additional contributions to the fund, whatever that kind of looks like. But at the moment, just the initial 100 million from the province.
Awesome. And then will there be intakes each year?
The hope is to provide, you know, a permanent enduring fund that provides grant funding with some continuity over many years. We are still just the interim stewards of the fund. So what it looks like down the road, you know, may evolve, but for now, I believe the hope is to have, you know, annual funding available. And in this first year, we've got these 2 intakes. We'll learn from this first year and with the grants working group and make some recommendations for next year.
There is one more question if we have time, or answer
Sure.
that later. Okay. It says, how will the Watershed Security Fund create long-term funding streams to nations?
I can start this if you want.
Thanks, Jenna. Sure.
Essentially, we're still kind of working through, as Madison had mentioned in the overview, we're still working through kind of that co-development of a permanent entity and defining what that looks like and what the fund looks like in the long term as an enduring kind of fund. So in this kind of initial bit, we've realized that there are a lot of watershed needs out there, and we're trying to get some funding out as quickly as we can in a meaningful way. So we'll be looking to learn from this process and then develop a process for kind of the longer funding. The way that our streams are kind of aligned at the moment, we hope will allow for kind of starting a project and then applying in a future year for maybe the second stream to continue on once the initial kind of startup has kind of is starting to come to completion to work through, so that we're not just funding for one project, you just get it started, and that's our hope that we can continue on, although it might look different in practice, as well as we don't have a specific 1 year or 1 fiscal kind of limit on funding, so allowing for that kind of continuation if needed, or for multi-year projects to be funded as well. So they're kind of some initial starts, as well as we'll be looking to kind of building out this further with our grants working group, and when we're co-developing that permanent entity and what that looks like and what funding looks like in the future. Maybe Leanne, maybe you can go through the next presentation, and then we can take some more
Sure.
questions after.
Sounds good. Okay, well, thanks for the questions. So for the next part of our webinar, we'll go through the application form kind of step by step and continue to answer questions at the end. So as I mentioned, a Word version of the form with some initial instructional text is available on the website. And whether you're applying online or submitting a Word application by email, or even if you're developing an application through one of the online interview conversations with one of our staff, we do recommend you download this Word version and use it as a tool, as there's some good guidance throughout the form itself and also in the budget form, which is available to download from our website as well. So the application starts off asking for some basic information about your organization and contact information. And in addition, as part of our commitment to UNDRIP, we ask applicants to identify their organizational relationship to First Nations in BC using that I4DM matrix that we shared earlier. And on the application form itself, we do provide a link to information on the matrix, the same info that Adarshana included in the chat, so that project teams can familiarize themselves with it and self-identify. And then after the organizational information, section 2 of the application gives an opportunity to describe your project or initiative and how it addresses watershed health and security, including relevant prior or future work. And we also ask applicants to identify up to 2 funding themes or areas of work that are most relevant to your project. And these are the funding themes that I mentioned earlier. We're not prioritizing projects based on these funding themes. It's just to help show the range of potential work that could be resourced through the fund, and they can be helpful categories in our project communications and project stories as we share out the good work that's happening. We also ask people to indicate which water basin and territories their project activities will take place in, so we can understand and document the geographic distribution of funds and project work. And we do have some similar data by geography for Indigenous Watersheds Initiative projects and Healthy Watersheds Initiative projects that were funded through watershed restoration and watershed health funding from the province previously. So with that data, we can start to see the evolving picture of funded watershed work by watershed basin, but it's not a complete picture. And we are hoping to do more to better understand the complex funding landscape in BC and to help identify needs, gaps, and potential opportunities to dovetail with complementary funding programs in the future. For this first year, though, we're just going to do our best to consider regional equity and funding decisions, including listening to applicants' experiences and understanding of community impacts and needs. We do know that more thorough research and gap analysis could be planned and resourced in the coming year for the purpose of better understanding needs and gaps and potentially prioritizing certain regions or basins. And another idea we have for down the road is to potentially offer some facilitated support to applicants and funded organizations regarding other available funding sources. But that's going to take us a little bit of time to resource. And we know that funding needs far surpass available dollars across the province. And so we're relying on a number of assessment approaches in our review, shortlisting, and decision-making process to make these early year decisions to support regional equity in the distribution of funds. In terms of project information, we also asked applicants to indicate which funding stream they're applying within based on the amount requested in their application, and to tell us the project duration for which funding is requested and the project start date. So projects can be short-term or multi-year up to 3 years, and funding is not tied to a particular fiscal year. Section 3 of the application is an opportunity for organizations to describe their approach to advancing UNDRIP. Using a framework developed by Tara Marsden, the application form gives First Nations organizations the option of providing their distinct perspective on UNDRIP in relation to their project. And non-First Nations-led organizations are asked to describe how they're planning to action UNDRIP in 5 or 6 key ways. So in addition to helping us understand and assess projects for funding, successful applicants can expect to report out on these commitments once their work is underway or completed, so we can better understand and share collective progress over time on UNDRIP commitments. Section 4 touches on the additional assessment criteria or lenses that we discussed earlier in part 1, and applicants have the option of speaking to one or more of these in relation to their project. And as I mentioned earlier, these are all important to us and will help us in understanding and prioritizing applications. Projects at higher levels of funding, we would expect to see more responses in all of these areas, and projects at the lower funding streams might just focus on a few. I think I already covered this in the first section around why we believe these are important, but it's included here again in the guide, just for quick reference for that section of the application. So project partnerships may also be relevant to your work, and we have questions on those. Partnerships can be an important indicator of collaboration and community connection, or an organization's relationship to First Nations. However, we'll not be evaluating proposals based on the number of partners. We're more interested in the quality of partnerships, so we have some questions on the application form about that. And as I mentioned, letters of support are optional but not required. They can be in email format or provided as copies of letters of support addressed to other funders. But if your project does involve a partnership and relationship with First Nations, if it's not in a letter of support, there should be a number of other ways to demonstrate that. We know that sometimes letters of support can burden organizations who are often fielding many such requests, so other evidence is good too. Section 6 of the application asks for the amount of funding being requested and related budget information, and includes a list of eligible expenses. So eligible expenses include staffing and labor, program or project planning, design, delivery, coordination, communications, consultant fees, convening and relationship building workshops and travel, Indigenous ceremony and cultural protocols, honoraria, building cultural competency, and admin of up to 10%. And we do encourage proposal budgets that support elders, youth, and ceremony, and resources to help you share the story of your project work. And site costs and project-related capital purchases are also eligible, with some limitations which are explained on the budget form. For projects in Stream 1, that's the Headwaters grants under 50,000, we only ask for a summary description of how watershed security funds would be used for the project expenses. But for projects in Stream 2 of up to 150,000 and Stream 3 up to 500,000, we do need you to complete the budget form on our website. If you do have another budget that you've completed for another application, it's possible that we can accept that as an alternative. But again, you'd want to reach out to Adarshana, our program coordinator, well in advance of the deadline, so that we can make sure that the information provided is what we need to assess your application. So this is an excerpt from the budget form. It includes several categories of expenses which might be relevant to your project, and there are explanatory notes right on the form that provides guidance. For staff and contract wages, we ask you to list the type and number of positions and total expense for each, including mercs and benefits if that's applicable. And then we also ask you to provide an estimate for the number of full-time, full-year positions and the estimated number of seasonal or part-time positions. For site costs, example of eligible site costs would include rental of equipment, vehicles, boats, construction materials such as soil, concrete, plant materials, shovels, site fencing, or storage that stays on the site, fuel or delivery costs for site prep activities, travel to from the site, water sampling, processing, production of maps, drone footage, that kind of thing. Capital purchases which are necessary to the project and which add to the organization's asset base beyond the project timeframe are allowed, but typically they shouldn't exceed 25% of project expenses. So they could include some IT hardware or software, and of that 10% shouldn't be more than 10% for those costs. And for purchase of equipment that stays with the applicant organization, such as some vehicles, survey instruments, radio receivers, water monitoring equipment, typically shouldn't exceed 15% of project expenses. So combined, that's 25%. For engagement, we encourage applicants to include budget for ceremony and protocol. I think I already mentioned that. Also, for training and peer learning, we really like to see that. Also evaluation and sharing the story of your work. Photographers, videographers, and other costs to create or supply written or visual digital content are also welcome. There's also an other category. If you have a budget expense that doesn't fit easily into these categories that we just described, please feel free to identify them here. And as I mentioned, we can allow up to 10% for admin. In the final section of the application, you have the option of providing additional information such as videos or website links, and it gives you some guidance on how to submit supplementary documents if you'd like. And then we give people an opportunity to let us know if you're interested in being added to a list to be notified of future potential learning opportunities related to UNDRIP, watershed engagement and learning events, and funding supports. So as we've said, we're still in the early stages of developing our grant funding program, but in the future, we hope to be able to offer some resources and engagement opportunity for applicants, grantees, and people working in the watershed sector. So yeah, feel free to let us know if you'd like to know about those things in the future. We also know these applications are a lot of work, and it can be challenging and frustrating with all the different formats, timelines, and interests that different funders have. So we hope we're being as clear and transparent as we can, and we welcome feedback as people learn about the program and go through the application process. And we really appreciate you taking the time to learn about the program, and just want to thank you for the work you do and for your shared commitment to this inspiring, impactful, and healing work. So that's it for the presentation, and we can move to questions.
Thanks, Leanne. If 50 projects are approved, would there be an average size in terms of dollars of grant?
Well, that estimate was based on us running a few numbers with, a number of projects in each of those 3 funding streams. And I don't have the exact mix at my fingertips. And it's really going to depend on what we receive. And that was just sort of for illustrative purposes. But within those 50 projects, it was I don't think it was exactly a third in each of those funding streams, but a mix in each of the funding streams.
Great. And maybe I'll ask Jenna this one. How has FNFC sought nations' input on the development of the grants program?
Yeah, thanks, Madison. So the First Nations Water Caucus is kind of co-developing this work. So the Water Caucus is comprised of First Nation, regional, and technical delegates from major watersheds across BC. And through this as well on our grants working group, we have additional external members, including Tara Marsden, and we'll be looking at further kind of during the co-development process about how, like, working with the First Nations Water Caucus on that co-development about how to engage further with nations on developing this permanent entity. So
Thanks, Jenna. Who anyone making the decisions on funding?
I can answer this one. So staff will bring forward the applications and do an initial review and then take it to the grants working group, and the grants working group will bring forward recommendations that will be approved by the joint executive. And the joint executive is comprised of that group that Madison ran us through earlier on the overview of the fund, with representatives from the First Nations Water Caucus, REFBC board, and the CEO of REFBC and the executive director of FNFC.
Thanks, Leanne. Our organization is a non-First Nations led organization, and we would like to better understand UNDRIP and how we can build understanding and relationships with First Nations in BC. Do you have any advice or resources?
I can jump in on this one, and then do you want to add to it, Jenna?
Sure.
Okay. Yeah, so there's lots of really great resources out there. If you're a non-Indigenous or non-First Nations led organization, and I guess we recommend you start by doing as much as you can to learn about the nation in whose territory you're working. And there's often a lot of information that you can learn on your own to start out with, you know, as you're building your understanding and maybe before you've even approached a nation. And then there's some other great workshops and training. We have a number of resources available, and we've listed them in our FAQs document, but for insights on the relationship between UNDRIP, decolonizing practices, and watershed security work, there's some great resources that were produced through the Healthy Watersheds Initiative. There's a great report by Tara Marsden, and that's available on the Healthy Watersheds Initiative website. I think, Darshana, you might be able to pop that in the chat. There was also some great posters that were produced that show specific articles from UNDRIP and how project teams have, through their watershed work, have advanced those. There was a great series of workshops through Nahanni Creative called Decolonizing Watersheds, and again, there's some links available to learn about some of the outcomes of those workshops, and you can also sign up to do your own self-directed study through workshops at Nahanni Creative, and then also other workshops that they offer through Zoom or in person. And then yeah, examples of First Nations and non-First Nations approaches to UNDRIP are also in the Healthy Watersheds Major Outcomes Report. And there's a great webinar on the REFBC website called UNDRIP and You, What Does UNDRIP Mean for Your Organization? And that's a pre-recorded webinar. There's also a great resource for local governments available through the Climate Caucus, and it's called Aligning Local Climate Action with UNDRIP. Jenna, do you have anything you want to add?
I think that what you provided was pretty sufficient.
Okay.
Don't know if we have any other questions in the chat, but I'm wondering, there was a question was answered in the chat and in the Q&A, but maybe Leanne, if you could just build on it a bit about the reporting requirements.
Oh, sure. So generally with reporting, you know, we're looking to, we don't want it to be overly burdensome on applicants. We really want to approach it as sort of a learning model where we can share outcomes from the work and track and share progress on watersheds health and well-being overall. And we'll probably be looking at reporting maybe about once a year. We're still developing the reporting format, and we'll do that with the grants working group and try to share an indication of the kind of questions that we'll be asking, like as soon as we can. We know that it's helpful for project teams to know when they're designing their project and starting out what we'll be looking for in terms of reporting. But for multi-year projects, once a year, we'd be looking for some kind of a project update and then a final report. And for single year projects, just a final report at the end. Again, really approaching it as in a learning model, wanting to amplify your learnings and experiences, share those where we can, and just help grow overall understanding of the importance and impact of the work and areas for further resourcing or further support. So that's our overall approach so far.
Thanks, Leanne. Don't see any additional Q&As in the Q&A box.
Question that came up in the chat. Is there any work to advocate to stop the further harm to watersheds, like discontinued clear cutting or the forests which protect water systems?
Jenna, do you want to take that one?
Sure. I don't know if I have a clear answer with the fund and the fund's relation to this work. I'm sure there's lots of really great work out there to try and advocate to stop, and probably needs to be more work to advocate to stop harm of watersheds. I don't know, Leanne, maybe you can build on that.
Sure. I think in terms of our role, we want to amplify the work and learnings from grant funded work. So, you know, it may be that project funding is supporting important information about the health of watersheds and cumulative impacts over the years. And we would want to share those stories and learnings from funded work and amplify that. And that would be kind of our role. We haven't talked about a direct advocacy role on issue, like specific watershed issues just yet, as it's early days. And I think our role in that kind of thing, you know, that would need to be thought through with the governing parties moving forward. But really our role is to amplify the funded work and share the stories and impact and issues that project teams are dealing with. So if some of that comes out as part of that sharing, that would be important.
Thanks, Leanne. I see one more question has come through. Says you have mentioned UNDRIP generally, but DRIPA is just as important considering that tripartite arrangements 3G will be required. Is it okay to assume DRIPA-related work with the province is applicable? And what about international work that is transboundary salmon and water-related implications to nations?
I could touch on this a little bit, or do you want to jump in first, Jenna, and then I can?
You go ahead.
Okay. There was a few parts. I'm going to work backwards, but if I end up missing the first part of the question, just remind me, Madison. So with the transboundary work would be eligible as long as a significant portion of it is directly relevant to territories in the province of BC. And then, so with DRIPA legislation, you know, I think it would be relevant. I think the only caveat would be if it's a responsibility of the provincial government to resource and do that work, we wouldn't want to take money away from community-based work to support something that is the responsibility of the province to resource and fund. But would imagine that there is a lot of crossover, and so it would make sense that some project funding that's supporting UNDRIP and watershed health would be relevant to concurrent or related, say, policy changes to support commitments to DRIPA. Jenna, do you feel like I
think you
got that? Okay.
Yeah, I think you covered that. Definitely, yeah, DRIPA is just as important as considering UNDRIP. Great. Well, seeing no more questions, I might just wrap things up, but if questions, oh, I just see another one had popped through.
Says the question is, if you are submitting a development application for a multi-stakeholder governance body, is it required to have provincial approval for such a process, or can that be part of the proposal or in progress?
Leanne, you can answer, but it might be helpful, uh, Ramona, if you maybe set up a time to chat with Adarshana, our project coordinator. It might be helpful just to learn a little bit more about the situation so we can answer more appropriately and encourage anyone else who has questions and outstanding that weren't answered, or if you have any additional, to give us an email and set up a time to chat through any of your questions, and we'll be able to kind of work through things a little bit in more detail, specific kind of considerations and things like that, as well as you can email Adarshana if you'd like to kind of go through that, the Zoom application process and things like that. So just encourage you to reach out to us with any questions or comments. And we'll be updating our frequently asked questions to address some of the questions raised today if they're not already covered in our frequently asked questions. As well as we're continuing to share feedback from the webinars with our grants working group. And we'll be posting this webinar recording to our website. Yeah, I just wanted to take a moment to thank everyone for attending and answering all of the really great questions. We very much appreciate it as we continue to learn and grow. This is just the first intake. This fund will be going through kind of evolving as we go and learning from different processes as we co-develop the permanent entity. So just really thank you for your time here today. And yeah, thanks in advance for reaching out to us.